In the 1990s, Naughty Dog became a namesake amongst the gaming industry for the Crash Bandicoot series on the PlayStation console. Fast forward about a decade later, and the team at Naughty Dog made the executive decision to reinvent the type of games they make with the introduction of the Uncharted series. And after 3 entries on the PlayStation 3, they were all respectively critically acclaimed for their story, Indiana Jones / Tomb Raider-esque inspirations, and huge action set pieces. Following the release of Uncharted 2 Among Thieves in 2009, Naughty Dog split their team into 2 halves, with one focusing on the development of Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, and the other focusing on a brand new IP, one that would become known as The Last of Us. The Last of Us was looking to be even more of a departure from any Naughty Dog game prior, using elements of survival horror, much more mature and gruesome subject matter, and a darker atmosphere overall. The game was eventually released in 2013 to high critical acclaim, mainly being praised for the story, the relationship between Joel and Ellie that develops during the course of the campaign, the amazing soundtrack and sound design, and the technical marvel that it was. It came as no surprise then that Naughty Dog would eventually conceptualize and craft a sequel to The Last of Us, and come 2016, The Last of Us Part 2 was officially unveiled to the world. Anticipation was high for the game's release, as many players including myself couldn't wait to get their hands on the game. After numerous delays, the game was slotted for a June 19, 2020 release date. A month prior to the game's release, however, there was a huge spoiler leak for the game's story, leading many longtime fans of the first game to make preconceived notions and judge the game extremely harshly prior to its actual release. I, for one, was fortunate enough to avoid any type of leaks, spoilers, and overall information about the game, as that's how I like to go into newly released titles. But even with that said, the game still has proven to be hugely controversial. Now, 7 years later, after the first game's release, and 6 years in the making, we pose the question, does The Last of Us Part 2 live up to its predecessor, or does it warrant all of the controversy it's been receiving? Today, I will be reviewing The Last of Us Part 2. In terms of the story of The Last of Us Part 2, I'm going to make my review of it specifically very brief, as this game is extremely hard to discuss without taking spoilers into consideration and talking about them. Hence why people are also arguing that the marketing for the game was misleading, which I of course personally believe was warranted. The story of The Last of Us Part 2 takes place 5 years after the events of the first game. Ellie and Joel have been living in the community of Jackson, located in Wyoming. Ellie and Joel have both developed new relationships and interests, and after a huge incident disrupts the lives of the residents in Jackson, our protagonist sets out on a journey to make amends and achieve righteous justice. All of the controversy the game is facing stems from the story of the game, and I have to say that in my own opinion I found the story to be incredible, completely unique with its subject matter and the messages/themes it chooses to shed light on and discuss, and further advances the interest in the world of The Last of Us. The actions one makes has consequences, and as Arthur Morgan from Red Dead Redemption 2 put it best, revenge is a fool's game. The game is a character analysis on people and how people respond to both physical and psychological trauma, which is fascinating to play out. The game is also great at evolving the foundation of the world itself, from new infected being introduced to the backstory of new factions and their motivations, and the actual scope of how nature overtakes the ruins of the old world. If you are a fanatic of storytelling and one-of-a-kind characters, you without a doubt should experience this game. Relationships will be tested, and so will the player's feelings. The gameplay for The Last of Us Part 2 is mostly made up of the same gameplay mechanics and gameplay loops from the first game, but also adds newer features and further revitalizes the survival horror genre. Gameplay specifically consists of stealth, clunky gunplay that matches the world, brutal physical combat, scavenging for ammo/materials that are crucial for survival, and traveling from point A to point B with various obstacles in between, whether it's human factions or the infected. The gunplay specifically may be a turnoff to some players, as all the weapons are semi-automatic or bolt action and ammo is extremely limited, resulting in a very slow-paced shooting mechanic game in comparison to other third-person shooters. But once you grow accustomed to it, it's actually quite satisfying when you get into a situation where you've only got 2 bullets left, 3 enemies coming at you, and manage to pull off 2 headshots and a melee kill with such entertaining, brutal animations. Ammo is clearly meaningful. Now let's talk about the melee kills. as they are extremely bloody and are completely varied in terms of what weapon is in your hands. If you have a bat, Ellie will clearly swing for a lethal swing to the head as quick as possible. But if you have a machete, Ellie will break down the enemy with a few slices before putting them out of their misery. Killing enemies doesn't even result in an instant death, as you'll hear some enemies screaming in agony, their teammates calling their name, or choking on their own blood before they can make a sound. Traversing the world is enjoyable just as much as it was in the first game. Not only is it breathtaking in terms of its visuals, but we'll get into that into the graphics segment, but the environments tell a story, whether it's nature itself, the architecture, or notes you'll find all throughout the world, in buildings and on dead corpses. Finding various items will aid in your survival, and the more items and scraps you uncover, the less difficult your journey will be, as you'll be able to craft Molotovs, stun grenades, and much more on the go. The skill tree is average in my personal opinion, as you're able to acquire new skills by collecting supplements throughout your playthrough, but a certain event in the middle of the game sort of defeats the entire purpose of the skill tree altogether. Gun customization is great in this game, but I would argue is also a tad limited, as the upgrades don't add too much of a variation in gunplay and instead seem to be underplayed, but they do look great. Now, where the gameplay of the game is at its best is when you're battling the infected. Whether it's traditional runners and clickers or newly introduced shamblers, you will be put into such tense situations that even I had to take a break at times just to regroup myself. The game, not necessarily is scary, but is definitely thrilling and anxiety driven. There's also a boss fight that I won't talk too much about, but it proves to be a very memorable moment in my own gaming memories and highly tense. Finally, Battling Humans is a great game of hunters and hunting, as it is a constant cat and mouse game that flips back and forth between the player and the enemy, and being able to take either an action-oriented guns blazing approach or a stealth approach that adds great variation to the gameplay overall. There are gameplay sections, however, that do drag on a bit in terms of the amount of NPCs and puzzles that are thrown at the player in order to drag out the length of the game, but in terms of its pace, it's still adequate and great. Overall, the gameplay is much of the same as the original, but if you love The Last of Us 1, you're going to love the gameplay of this one, as it's entertaining, tense, interesting, and tactical. The presentation on a visual and audio standpoint for this game is exquisite. This is one of the best looking games I've ever played, with foliage and nature looking so lifelike that every leaf, tree, and blade of grass looks like it was individually placed by the development team. Lighting is also extremely realistic and the shadowing is accurate. There's really not much I can say other than the graphics are completely amazing. The soundtrack of the game is beautifully composed by Gustavo, and let me get this right, Santaolalla, once again. Sorry if I mispronounced that. And the choice of songs and instruments that play throughout the game match its atmosphere perfectly and elevate the situation and drama. However, moments that music would have further added to the experience, in my opinion, were absent in a lot of key areas, leading for the soundtrack overall to be a tad underutilized this time around. The performances and voice acting are stellar as well. It's just some of the best in this medium of gaming, and this leads me to my biggest praise of the game, which is the facial animations. The facial animations are so incredible and easily the best in any video game thus far. If a character is angry, you'll see it. If they're sad, you'll see it, and if they're happy, you'll see it. The facial animations further add to the immersion of the story and sell the player on what the character is feeling and outputting. Animations like these put games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey to shame, as the characters in that game look like they have a blank expression majority of the time, while expressions in The Last of Us Part 2 look so lifelike you think you're watching an actual physical movie. Overall, presentation, graphics, sound design, and performances are incredible. This game is a technical marvel and an achievement for what can be done on 7-year-old hardware. The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that will be looked back on with technical praise and narrative criticisms, but through all of this, it still manages to achieve one cohesive thing: starting a discussion. The team at Naughty Dog have once again outdone themselves, and I myself find the narrative powerful, the gameplay highly entertaining as it revitalizes survival horror, and eye candy for any gamer as it's a technical marvel. The Last of Us Part 2 is a 10 out of 10.